Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for July 28th, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined online via video. We have John Markley. Welcome to the show, John.
Thank you. I'm glad to be back.
All right, thanks for being here. And also on the couch here, we have our great security analyst for AT&T. We have Matt Kaiser.
How's it going, John?
Matt, how's it going? And Stan Nurilov. How are you doing, Stan?
Pretty good.
All right, great. And I did want to acknowledge we have a lot of stories that are coming out lately. Black Hat and DEF CON are next week, so a lot of those stories are kind of getting a little bit pre-released for discussion. You have some comments on that, Matt?
Yeah, there's a huge amount of new security news, and most of it is sort of a teaser for talks that are coming up at Black Hat or DEF CON, which most people will know are the big US hacker cons for the year. It's hard to really cover them. I mean, you can cover the bits and pieces that have been teased out, or
right.
I'd like to use the word hype because some of this stuff it's very exciting and flashy when you don't know the mystery behind how it's being done, because most people will save the good details for their talk
right.
to get people to come. I tend to think that some of this is being blown up to be much bigger than it actually is, so it's, in my opinion, we're going to sort of save those stories for after they've been reported, and once the details are all out,
right.
we can sort of separate
Pick the good ones from the hype ones, maybe, right?
Exactly.
Okay. Anyway, so for those watching, you're probably watching this the week of Black Hat, so I'm sure there's a lot of interesting stories if you want to stay tuned to what's going on in that, because it seems like there's a lot of interesting stuff coming out in Black Hat this year around. So. All right, so first story we have is, it's my story. So the first story is I wanted to make everybody aware of there was a vulnerability recently acknowledged in Bind. Bind is the software which basically provides DNS resolution service. So there's a few vendors out there, but Bind is probably the biggest one. It's by ISC, and they acknowledge that there's a flaw which involves the way Bind handles some queries related to transaction key records. This flaw exists in pretty much all major versions of Bind, 9.10 up into the 9.8, 9.9 branches, etc. I would recommend you go take a look at that to see if you're impacted. There is a patch available. The thing about this one, it's kind of one of those things where it made me really nervous, because DNS, as we know, is kind of the glue that keeps all of the internet really working. DNS is that thing when you type in, an address in your browser, like google.com, that name gets translated to an IP address. The way that happens is through Bind. So if that process is broken, you basically can't get to anywhere on the internet. So the vulnerability here is that someone has discovered that there is a way that they could very trivially send a single packet that's pretty easy to create that would crash the Bind process, which if someone did that en masse across the entire internet, could effectively just create an entire blackout on the internet, which would be a problem. Fortunately, the person who reported the vulnerability doesn't seem like he's going to be the kind of person who would leverage that. ISC is patched it, so we should have especially the critical DNS, like the root DNS servers, will all be patched and whatnot. And there's no indications that the vulnerability is going to has been actively exploited in the wild, so the lid's been kept pretty tight on it. So it looks like we're pretty safe, but had it gotten out into the wild, it would be a real problem, potentially.
This is one of those interesting bugs that I think scanning for it would actually potentially cause the bug to be exploited. I mean, I'm not sure how you would test for the exact, without actually removing the payload, right? So, if you scan, then you try again and your server's down, congratulations, it worked. But then you've caused someone some real heartache.
Right. So yeah, one to watch. And as I said, if you do run your own DNS service for your company or even for larger parts of the internet in general, this is something that you'd want to take attention to and get your servers patched as soon as possible.
It's not the first DNS issue we've seen either, right? It's one we've seen in the past, so just keep it up to date.
Right. Yeah, usually the people who are maintaining DNS are pretty much on top of it, because everybody knows that it's kind of a critical service on the internet, keeps the internet basically functioning. There have been cases in the past that people have identified. I don't know, well, maybe there have been, but I'm not aware of ones that could actually create a denial of service against the DNS service or against the Bind service. But I know there's been some, what was the transaction ID one where you could spoof? You could do like some injection of DNS.
You've got me.
Anyway.
Stan?
I seem to recall something like that. You can
Yeah, the
spoof
Kaminsky bug was
responses
something like
or
that,
something
right?
like that, yeah.
Right. Moving along, story number 2 is one you were looking at, Matt. There's a new bug in OS X that looks, or I should say OS 10, that can be leveraged. Can you give me more information on that one?
Not just OS 10, OS 10, 10.10.
Oh.
I'm not even kidding. I
OS
was reading this
X,
and I was like,
X?
yeah,
No, I'm just
exactly. Yeah. So Stefan Esser, who runs the blog section1.de, which I think is a great name. I have a German background, so anything German, I'm just like, yes. He found this bug in OS 10. Apparently, the developers in this version, they introduced a new feature which allowed you to arbitrarily log to a file, any file you want.
Okay.
Which sounds like a good idea, a little more flexibility. Unfortunately, they left out some very important checks, and they're also using an environment variable that a user can control. So what it adds up to is that this bug allows you to write arbitrarily to any file on the file system, including the ones that are usually protected by root.
Oh.
And you can actually use some clever tricks based on this to get a privilege escalation. Thank you, Stan.
Right.
Which means that you can go from being a regular user on the system or a regular process on the system to being root. And at that point, the game is over. So it's pretty interesting. There's this variable DYLD print to file. I think it has to do with a dynamic loading function. And there's a few other things that are interesting about like the child processes. If you use this variable, it doesn't actually close that file, the log file that you've written to. That handle still exists. So if you have child processes, they also have access to that, even set UID processes. So it sort of just starts spiraling out of control. So it's interesting. 10.10 is affected. 10.10.4 and 10.10.5 the beta. 10.11 is not affected at this point. So something to keep an eye out for if you're using
so this would be
OS
one
10.
where I would be concerned that a bad person, like a malicious malware writer, would use this in order to deploy malware, with root level privileges onto a machine, which would be the problem.
Right. If they had managed to get something on the machine, or you've got a process that's properly restricted because it's not allowed to be root, it's only allowed to run in its own little corner of the operating system. This is the way that you would allow that process would be able to jump up, become root, and then start wreaking some serious havoc.
Right.
So it's not a remotely executable bug by any means. That's an important point to make, is that this is just a local privilege escalation. This is not remote. This is not code execution by itself, but it permits you to get the permissions you need in order to do it.
Right, but if I could send you an email that had an attachment with an executable in it, and you were foolish enough to open that up and run it, they could escalate their privileges and then put some worse malware on there that has escalated privileges. So
correct. The proofs of concept, and I know Stan was looking at them too, they're fairly simple. I mean, you really just have to, write a little bit of code that asks for those right permissions, and then it just kind of works.
Gives them to you?
Yeah, pretty much. As long as you're including that reference to the environment variable, it seems that once you've opened that door, that's it.
Right. Okay. Game over in that case, I guess, right? All right, interesting story. One to keep an eye on to see if anybody starts actively exploiting that in the wild. As Macintosh in general, Apple's operating system, for a long time we saw the PC market dominated with malware, and it seems like more and more over the past 10 years, maybe a little less, you're seeing a lot more Mac-related types of malware.
I'd be interested to see if there's any sort of correlation between, I assume there is, correlation between market share and the availability of bugs for those platforms, or the interest in bugs. I just want to know what's the time gap. At what point does someone wake up and say, wait a second, these guys have got X% of the market, it's time to start developing.
Right.
We saw that with Unix. So you remember in the 70s, 80s, we saw a lot of Unix vulnerabilities and worms, and then all of a sudden PCs burst out as a larger body, and you stop seeing Unix stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just reflecting, when you're talking about in the old days of Unix, there were lots of various bugs, but one of the real simple ones is like a process would start. You know how a lot of processes that start on Unix, they drop a file in the temp directory that has the PID. And then when they want to shut down, they basically will cat that PID file. They'll say like kill and then cat whatever's in the PID file. So in some cases that PID file would be writable by anybody. So you could just put in semicolon and then your process. So then when this process would shut down, it would run your whole thing, and you would
With the
basically
permissions of
be
the
able to
previous
take
process?
you as root. So there's still a lot of vulnerabilities you could look for on. That's like an old school trick on Unix. If anybody cares to look for processes that aren't smart about how they shut themselves down. In any event, good story. And moving on to the next story, John, you had some tips on keeping your device secure. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that one.
Sure. So basically, what I've kind of come to the realization is that there's a lot of things that we all seem as common sense. We do it every day. We say it on this program all the time. And it just becomes a matter of, let's put it all on one slide, maybe hit some of the high points, especially as we become more and more mobile dependent in this, in your world. I mean, nobody lives anymore without having their cell phone, glued to their side like we used to have our pagers, probably more so. So I put together a little slide to try and capture some of the more common things that we recommend for, keeping your mobile device secure. The first few are simple, right? Set and use passwords. You wouldn't be surprised at how many people that's the first thing they want to do is, how do I remove this password on my mobile? Don't do that. That's, a lot of the attackers want the physical access to the device. The common sense stuff, don't if you get an email or a text or a message from somebody you don't know and it contains an attachment or contains a web link, don't click on it. Don't open it up. Just delete it. I hate to say that you might lose somebody new, but still, it's we see too much of that. So those are the kind of the common sense ones. More on the mobile side, keep your device up to date. The apps all get regularly updated for security issues. So does the operating system. You got to keep it up to date. We always say don't jailbreak or root your device. Kind of goes back to the up to date thing, right? You can't keep your device up to date as well as if you rooted it, and now no longer can you get access to the current version of the operating system. And also, if you think about it, that kind of leads to the next item, which is don't go to the third-party apps. You want to get your stuff from official sources. A lot of people root and jailbreak their device to get the data or the app off of something that they maybe not normally be able to get to, and it becomes a matter of, well, where did that data come from? Where did that app come from? And most of the malware that you see, especially in the mobile environment, comes from third-party app stores that are not official. So just that's something to keep in mind. The latter two things that kind of are a little bit more tricky. Keep aware of, when you install an app, most apps ask you for permission. Android asks you up front what your permissions are. iOS a lot of times asks you as the app runs. Be aware that does that app actually need access to your camera? Does that app actually need access to your texting? So there's things that apps ask for all the time, and you think, why does it really need that? And then the last point that I had to make on this slide really is observe and check unusual behavior on the device. It's really kind of more complicated, but if your device starts acting funny, you get a funny pop-up, the web browser you're surfing a web and the URL link is different than what you thought you went to. Those are just things you just got to keep aware of, and then once you've seen that, try and figure out, how do I fix this, or how do I respond to it properly. So just quick hit things to think about when keep that device secure.
Hey John, another good thing to look for probably is if your battery is dying a little bit faster. I think a lot of malware, when it installs itself, it really runs the battery dry. So that would be another good thing to look for. A hot screen, maybe, if your screen is on all the time. That sometimes malware disables certain, the phone from going to sleep. So those would be some of the other things to look for.
And I've seen that. That's a really good idea, Stan. Because I've seen, if you look at most of the devices that you have nowadays, the current ones, all have some kind of thing that lets you tell the battery indicator what was using the last bit of the the ergs of energy out there on your device. And you think, well, why at 2 o'clock in the morning, or why is such and such an app so busy?
Yeah, no, I think you've covered the really important bullet points here. And I think the first 2 or 3, having a password lock on your phone, don't open or respond to emails that have weird stuff in there that might, infect your device. and then installing only from the official store, that's going to probably prevent you from having to deal with any of these other things, like getting an app that's going to ask you to access your microphone for some reason. Like, why is this movie, listing program trying to access my microphone? Which means it's probably got something else embedded in there that's trying to do something bad. A good list to pay attention to, and if you have the option to set complex passwords, I would recommend that too. Some phones have the ability to have more than 4 digits for the password. We've seen that there are some unlocking tools out there, right? That you can plug into like a bad guy, if they get your phone, they can plug in and will try to brute force the password and then reboot the phone before, like, I guess it does like 3 tries or something, reboots, because after the 4th try, the phone will automatically lock and not accept anybody else's, So they have a whole scheme to try to brute force the password automatically and stuff. So the more complex you can make that, the better, in case your phone does get lost.
I would actually say, on the same note, there's some people will usually draw a pattern shape on it, and while that's okay, and people would think it's somewhat like a pin, there's something to know about that, is that when you take your finger and you wipe it across the screen, you basically draw with the oils from your fingers the shape of the pattern of your password. So anybody who turns the screen off looks at it, and if you haven't used that phone since you did that, you'll be able to at least pick out the path that you picked. Maybe they have to try it twice to go backwards, but it's not as secure as simply tapping the screen on the pin pad or entering a password with the keypad.
Right.
I actually saw somebody break that, just a little bit of baby powder, just sprinkle it on top of the phone and see that oil.
Yep.
Oh, interesting.
Oh, yeah.
All right, good tip. Very interesting. All right, well, thanks for the tips on that, and I think I learned something out of that one, because I did not know about the baby powder one, that's for sure. So moving on to the next story, this one's a little bit more hardcore. So Stan, you were looking into this new Hammertoss espionage tool that's out there?
Yeah, FireEye released a pretty good report tying a new piece of malware to a known APT group. They associate this with Russian hackers. They call this the APT-29 group. Some people call it Cozy Bear or MiniDuke or other things like that. So the reason they do that, I guess, is because they've noticed these hackers seem to come from a time zone that's associated with Russia. So that's where they're attributing the activity to. Now, what's interesting and unique about this tool is how many techniques it uses in order to stay advanced with how it gets its C2, so the way it communicates to the attacker. I know we've seen these kinds of techniques with other malware threat actors, but apparently, the number of these techniques and the way the malware tries to stay stealthy on the network is really, was impressive to FireEye, enough that they described this in large detail in this report. And now they actually mentioned that they've only seen this deployed, I think, at like 1 or 2 organizations. So this malware is so advanced
very targeted,
that the bad guys are only using this variant on a few enterprises, like when they need to, in some of the victims' environments. So what are some of the techniques? Well, the simple variant is obviously the malware goes out and it knows what the communication C2 is. But the second variant is actually it goes out to like Twitter. So it generates a Twitter handle daily. Every day the malware is going to run, it creates a new Twitter handle that is going to contact.
So is it using some kind of like Twitter name generation algorithm or something like that?
Yes, there's a Twitter name generation algorithm. It's probably very similar to like DJ algorithms that we've seen used. So this one uses somehow like like these things usually do, the date and some sort of a checksum on top of the date, and then concatenates it with like some sort of a word or something like that to make it look unique. So now, only the attackers will know, plus the malware, how to generate the next name. So every day a new one will be generated, and the malware will go out to Twitter and look for tweets. So if there are no tweets, or if this thing is not registered, the malware kind of goes back to sleep. It'll wake up the next day and try the same thing. But if the Twitter handle is registered, then basically what happens is you get a little blur. There's 2 pieces of information you get. You get like a unique key, and like some sort of a file size and a domain. And so basically the malware goes to that domain and looks for like an image or something, some kind of like a file that's around that size, whatever the number is. And sometimes it's like a JPEG or something like that. And inside the JPEG, at the end of where the valid data would be, they append a blob of encrypted C2 communications. And that's encrypted with two pieces. The one piece is the thing that's hard-coded in the malware. So there's a key in the malware that's hard-coded. But the other piece that's combined is the key from the Twitter message. So it uses those two pieces of information.
In order to decrypt.
So now, right, in order to decrypt, you really have to have both. You have to have that Twitter message, you have to have the piece of malware. So just having one or the other is not going to help you. So it's just one more way they kind of prevent people from knowing what the commands are, who come in later to do the forensics. And then, obviously, once they decrypt the command, they can do pretty much anything. I think some of the things they might be able to do is, I think this group in particular uses a lot of legitimate services out there, like cloud-based hosting, like, for example, a OneDrive or Google Drive or things like that normal people would use too, but they might pass the credentials, and like stolen information from the victim would be uploaded there. So those are some of the techniques. It's not a technique that we haven't seen before. It's just, I guess, the combination of all of these things together, using these online storage mechanisms, using Twitter in combination with the DGA type activity. So the combination of all of that, splitting up the keys, I think that makes it really advanced. And it seems like this Hammertoss malware is really, special for this group. They only deploy it when they need to. And hey, if Twitter is blocked or something like that, then these guys just move on and use a different variant of the malware. Another thing that FireEye points out is that these adversaries are so sophisticated that they are always watching how the network team is like responding to the victim. The victim network is responding, how they're cleaning up the malware, and they always adjust as soon as possible. So they recompile the malware, they deploy new variants. So it's really advanced threat. It's hard to stomp it out. The C2 is different each time. It could even be different on each computer. And that kind of can hamper some of the efforts to take the malware off the network.
So that's interesting. You said that they were very responsive. I assume that by now anything that came out in that report is probably burned to the ground.
Yeah, I always assume anything in these reports has always been already kind of taken offline, and that's why it gets reported on. What could you do? Yes, you could pre-register some of these. I suspect that generation algorithm, just like the part of the key is hard-coded, I think part of the word that helps you generate the DGA is also hard-coded. Oh. So you're not going to be able to like pre-register a whole bunch of handles for any campaign.
So it's per sample of the malware. It has its own.
Okay. Okay.
Exactly right. So, and we know that from all these reports, we know that from this group that they'll hard code the things they need to into the malware. The C2 they'll hard code. The key is individual for each piece of malware. So I think it just makes sense that they would do the same for the Twitter handle. Well, for them.
If they were smart like Stan is.
Yeah.
Yeah. This group, this APT29 group, they call it, being from Russia, I think a lot of times we associate a lot of this nation state intellectual property theft with China, and for years, like past 10 years, it's been that way. I would say with the past year or two here, it seems like this particular group has made they've been in the press quite a bit.
Yes.
In terms of doing similar types of tactics with similar types of very advanced tools like this that are very good at acting covertly on your network in a way that you're not going to pick it up. Yeah. And one of the things you mentioned is, it might only check in once a day. So if you're trying to monitor a massive network for your enterprise with hundreds of thousands of endpoints and only one machine's infected, trying to hit up to Twitter once at 3 o'clock in the morning, let's say, you might not notice that. Chances are you're not going to notice that. And so that makes it really difficult, whereas a lot of the traditional malware we see is usually a lot more noisy. They'll like check in every 5 minutes, up to the command and control, where these APT guys, they know, try to stay low and slow, hide in the background noise of your network traffic. It sounded like it was a pretty good report, pretty detailed from what
Yeah, I think so. I think
saying.
everybody should take the opportunity to read it. There's also an MD5 sum in there as well. So researchers can go up to like VirusTotal, download the sample, and go ahead and reverse engineer and figure out how it works. So if they ever have to face a threat like this, they'll be a little more prepared.
Right. Always good to have a good defense. So do your analysis and research so you know what to look for that might be on your network and you might not know about it. So on the lighter side of things, you had some kind of pop culture stuff you wanted to talk about comparing a couple of shows that are on TV nowadays.
Sure. So I mean, we at lunch we usually talk about this sort of thing. You know, have you seen the latest episode of this show or that show? And I know that we sometimes complain a little bit about how hacking is portrayed and defense is portrayed as well. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about and compare and contrast two shows that I think are probably the best examples of portraying, or maybe not the best, the most prominent examples of portraying hacking on television. And that's CSI Cyber, which is on CBS, and Mr. Robot, which is on USA. And they're very different shows, and there's a lot to be said about each one's approach. CSI Cyber, to me, is the same CSI formula. If you've been watching CSI for years, it's the cops always get their man sort of thing with a cyber spin to it. So it treats it sort of like, I don't know how to say, maybe more of a magical approach. And I'll explain what I mean by that. Where
it's like a Disney view of hacking.
And I can understand the reasons why they do things like this, where they treat it where it's something very different and new, and they try, on the one hand, to explain certain elements of it, but then they also sort of obfuscate and throw under the rug some of the more technical details so that an audience who's not familiar with it can really sort of understand it and enjoy it for the plot, maybe, for at least give it a little more of a different flavor than the other CSI shows. I mean, there are experts who advise them on the show, and I'm sorry I shouldn't have used air quotes. I'm sure the experts know their stuff, but the way it translates across is that it's a very sort of scary cyber world out there.
Very theatrical.
Yep. And if you, for example, in the first episode, you've got malware that shows up in a field of green code. All of a sudden, boop, there's a little bit of red code, and they go, "Whoa, we've got malware."
Right. Yeah. Like,
and
if you're ever going to be able to see, it's going to jump out at you in red code on your screen. It's not going to do that.
Yeah.
That's exactly how I see it. Like kind of like Neo in the Matrix.
Is that an IDA plugin? Because I want that.
Yes, but only I have it.
Oh, okay. No. I mean, but that's the thing. It's an approach that it's more about still being a cop show and still being something that's somewhat relatable. But I feel like a lot of the important details, if you're trying to educate people, because at the beginning of every show, they put in a definition of a term as if, we're here to teach you what these things are. This is your cybersecurity new scary thing of the week, and you need to learn about it so you can protect yourself. And that's an admirable, if you're really trying to do that, that's admirable. But the number of times they get the definitions wrong and the number of times they get their explanations wrong, it bothers me a little bit.
Right. I'm sure their technical experts who advise them are probably like banging their heads against the wall every time they watch whatever episode they just advised on. But,
One thing I look for when I watch CSI Cyber is the IP addresses. If you notice, one of the octets always is invalid.
Over 255?
Yeah, it's always over 255, and I always say that to my wife, and she never knows what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Well,
so I think to most people it doesn't even matter. But I find that, to your point, whenever they do explain a security topic, even in the show, they always go on and on about it. Like, that's not how we talk, for example, when we're dealing with something, right? We just say the term and we move on. But in the show, they like to explain the terminology a lot.
And that's a good segue, actually, into Mr. Robot's approach. I know we've talked about this, where
I love
Mr. Robot, it's... they talk about hacking, and hacking is a big part of the plot, but when they talk about it, they sort of assume that everyone in the room knows what they're talking about and moves on. And there's they throw out a casual reference to a Raspberry Pi, which is a small credit card-sized computer. But, they wouldn't say that on CSI Cyber. They're like, well, they use a Raspberry Pi, which is a small credit card-sized computer. It's very popular with hackers.
Right.
And Mr. Robot's like, yeah, it's his thing. We're going to use it. And everybody knows what it is. Let's just move on. And I like their approach to malware much more. Whereas CSI Cyber has their red and green code, Mr. Robot, at one point somebody puts a CD into a computer, the terminal pops up and goes away, and that's it. And
that's more realistic to how it would look in the real world. You're not going to see what happened on your machine.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So I think that's the big thing, is that the creators of Mr. Robot seem to be really striving to get the facts right. The guy that they have as their advisor, he wrote a couple books on, sort of searching for people on the internet and sort of collecting intel on people, and that shows there are scenes where they're trying to do background information on their targets when they're trying to break into a facility. And they're looking on these things online, they're trying to find their profiles, and I really like that sort of attention to detail.
Yeah, I like in Mr. Robot how it's a drama where you got people who are involved in like their lives, And then the hacking is really just kind of under the surface in the backdrop of it. And they don't really try to shove it down your throat and explain it to you. It's just there. So if you know what's going on, like when I watch it, there's like these little asides they just throw in. I'm like, son of a, like,
Yeah.
But they don't even like discuss it. It's just a one-liner that they just move on right from. And if you're in the business, you're like, wait a second, that was meaningful what you just said there. You know what I mean?
Or they're like, holy crap, you just showed a picture of the social engineer toolkit. I've seen that.
Right,
I've used that.
Right.
And it's great. The psychology part of Mr. Robot I like too. There's one episode, I think it was the second to latest, where it's mostly about social engineering, when Elliot's trying to talk his way into the facility. And there's their approach to it, which is it's sort of depressing, the way that they take this guy and they tear him down, their target, and they just sort of like ruin his day. But had it worked out, and I don't want to spoil too much, but it seems like a reasonable approach to try to manipulate somebody into doing something. I mean, they talk about the motivations behind it, the things that people are, they want out of life, the things they worry about, and then targeting those specific human vulnerabilities. Whereas when you've got the psychology in CSI Cyber, you've got the character of Avery Ryan, who's their team lead, I guess. She's also she's a psychologist, but the things that come out of her mouth, they don't make sense. I hate to say
maybe because we're not psychologists.
Maybe
we're
I'm not an expert
guys.
on it, but there are things where she's talking about natural flight or fight responses will cause the bad guys to go to higher ground, and they eliminate all these locations on the map that aren't below like 3,000 feet. I'm just looking at this. You've got to be kidding me. This doesn't make any sense.
But we should learn these techniques, right? So then we'll know to hide like below 3,000 feet or above.
If I'm ever on the run, I'm going down. Yes, definitely.
Underground.
Grand Canyon.
Right.
Never catch me there.
It's hard to watch any of these shows after if you ever watch war games with I always flare back to the Joshua hacking they hack the computer and the guy the computer responds as Joshua. That show is still, I think, what they're basing things like CSI Cyber on. Is that's what hackers can do, right? Get into those machines so simply.
Well, it's even more like, I think, Hackers, the movie with Angelina Jolie and Johnny Lee Miller.
Right.
That's the sort of flavor I get from CSI Cyber, where they're trying very hard to keep people's attention, and by making things visually interesting, they're getting way off base. You've got your red and green code. You've got these huge, the NOC that they operate out of, which has all these screens.
I've seen one of those once like that.
Yeah?
Yeah, a NOC with lots of screens in it.
Does it have a lot of things flying around?
No, it doesn't.
I mean, I know NOCs have a lot of screens, but I feel like that most of them are populated with consoles or view graphs and not like swirling things.
Not magic.
Not magic.
Well, interesting discussion. I think there's probably, I'm on camp Mr. Robot. I love that show. I don't really watch CSI Cyber. I think there's probably room for both.
I've watched
for
every
learning in
episode
both.
of CSI
yeah,
Cyber.
no, you watch
I make
everything.
a point to watch it. I mean, sometimes I laugh a little bit, but there are nuggets of things then that you watch and you say, I see what you're trying to do. And for the viewership that they have, there's probably some value in getting people accustomed to the idea that this is out there.
Right.
Now, whether it's a really educational show, and if it has more harm than good, I'm not really sure.
Right.
So
I'm kind of surprised you didn't bring up, what is that Scorpion show, or what was the one?
Oh my!
I don't want to segue the whole thing, but that one was in Fantasyland.
I've seen about maybe 2 minutes of that show, and when they were dangling a Ethernet cable out of an airplane to plug in a laptop to download the firmware to fix all the planes, I said, no, I don't think I can do this.
No, that's not practical. Okay, anyway, moving on. So let's quickly go over the internet weather. We've got a couple of things to discuss. So the internet weather report, this is where we kind of talk about the trends we're observing on the internet. The first chart here is the most probe ports. So this is where we see most of the scanning activity by sheer volume, not by the number of IP addresses involved in that activity. So just in sheer volume itself. There's actually quite a bit of movement. We've had a few of these ports go up. We're going to explain this one. So the real one that kind of jumps out on the screen here is 53 UDP, which is DNS. We're going to explain that. We're going to take a look at that in a second. 23 TCP has been at the top for a long time. That is Telnet. We know that there's a lot of these Internet of Things devices out there that are scanning to compromise additional Internet of Things devices, like your home router or your security camera DVR or your network attached storage. All these things, these little devices that people put on their network and they don't realize that they're open for attack or that they might have Telnet running. So a lot of the activity is related to that. 22 TCP is SSH. Similar types of activity going on here with that brute force password guessing against SSH. 80 TCP went down a slot this week. And then the 53 UDP we're going to look at a little bit closer. Some of these other ones like the ICMP, echo reply, or port and reachable requests, probably not security related. They might just be artifacts of some other scanning activity. We usually don't consider that a big security issue. 445 TCP, that's your Microsoft file sharing. That's down 2 spots. 443 TCP, your HTTPS is up 3 spots. That's always really high, so when it moves, it's not really moving that much, so I didn't get a chart on that one. However, this 21320 TCP, we don't normally see that one. We'll explain that one in a chart in a second. And then 8080 TCP is usually looking for proxy servers or other types of things like Tomcat, where there's a lot of administrative services that run for various web type services on that port. And then 1900 UDP is the Simple Service Discovery Protocol. That's down a little bit. We've been seeing a lot of reflection activity, attack activity on that. So the first one, 53 UDP, if you take a look at this picture here, you can see when I did this report, this is actually from July 28th, I grabbed this chart, and you can see it's way up. So it's like 700 million scan flows when we normally have kind of a noise floor of around maybe peaking at 50 million scan flows. So it's probably more than 10 times than usual. This actually turned out to be a DNS reflection DDoS attack against a particular person that we picked up. So somebody was using this protocol for reflection activity. We've talked about that a lot before. And a lot of times that will show up as scanning activity because UDP is a connectionless protocol, so it's kind of difficult to figure out state of if someone's really making that connection or not. In any event, that's what this activity was. So this is kind of an anomaly, not really an increase in scanning so much as an actual attack. And we have other more detailed reports that tell us who was part of that attack or was impacted by that. The next one, this 21320 TCP, this is an unassigned port. And we see a lot of scanning on this in general, and it goes up and down over time. It's kind of increased quite a bit here. This is a 90-day graph, and we're up around 50 million scan flows per hour. When I did a look on this, there's actually very few sources. There's only like less than 100 sources. I think it was 80 or something like that actually involved in this activity. But I'm pretty sure it's involved in scanning for proxy servers, because when you look up this port on the internet, you'll find that there are certain forms of malware out there. It looks like Top Arcade Hits might be one of them as a malware family that once it's on an infected machine, it opens a port on port 21320 and starts acting as a proxy server that can be used by the bad actor or his network of cohorts to use to proxy their activity. So that's probably what whoever's looking for this is probably looking for that type of activity, use these as proxies for anonymizing their traffic.
I'm curious, did you read deep into this? And the question I'm looking to answer is whether or not this is one of those situations where people will compromise machines, set up proxies, and then start selling them as a service. Or is this sort of just being created for someone's private use?
Yeah, I did not research it in depth, other than I was just trying to find a rationale for why someone was scanning for this strange port. I'm pretty sure this is the reason, because they're trying to find, now whether they're trying to find it because they're trying to identify infected devices or if they're trying to use it for proxy activity themselves, I'm not sure, but we'd have to ask the 80 or so people that are scanning why they're doing that.
Okay.
So in terms of the top 10 most sources probing, this is one always is more interesting to me because it has a lot less volatility in it, because it basically means that you've got a lot of computers that have been compromised that are doing scanning en masse. So somebody's told them to all start scanning. So this is indicative of when you have a lot of machines scanning particular ports at the same time. And again, 23 TCP is at the top. It's been at the top for a long time. Same thing, Internet of Things type devices. 445 TCP, we know that there's various pieces of malware out there that scan for that because there's still that old Microsoft vulnerability that people are still scanning for, that config are used and whatnot, and you can still scoop up some machines from that. 27015 TCP is related to gaming, not really a security related activity. 22 TCP SSH again, and then 17788 UDP. We've been looking at that one for a while. I didn't get a chart on it. However, it is related to some peer-to-peer file sharing stuff like BitTorrent. But I wanted to take a closer look at the 22 TCP stuff. So it went up 18 spots. That's quite significant movement to go up 18 spots in a week. And you can see what really happened here. This is a 180-day chart, and there's kind of around 1,000 or so scan SIPs always scanning, with little peaks here that go up to 1,700 or so scan sources. But all of a sudden, it has gone up quite dramatically in the past week here to about 3,000. So it's more than doubled in size in terms of the number of devices that are scanning on this. I didn't get a chance to try to figure out what parts of the world are involved in this activity. Again, I think there's probably a lot of these Internet of Things type devices out there involved with this, or a lot of Linux servers and whatnot that run SSH that get compromised, and then they start to look for more devices. The fact that they acquired so many very quickly here and they've got so many more is definitely some sort of botnet involved. So it might be another one to take a closer look at.
You know, there was a recent bug that was reported, and I'm not sure how widespread it was, that allowed someone to sort of bypass the restrictions on the number of guesses against an SSH server.
Oh, really?
Yeah. I heard varying reports as to it works everywhere or it works on very specific operating systems, but I had heard that it's there, so maybe someone is trying to take advantage of that and
maybe they've been
succeeding.
successful,
Yeah.
right? Because there's been a lot of recruitment here. They've gone from, around 1,000 or so scan sources to 3,000. So and it's in a short period of time, less than 7-8 days or so. So definitely one to watch, do some more analysis on, and try to figure out if there's any specific botnet that we could find that they're all chattering back to in terms of their command and control. So that's the show for today. Thank you for joining us. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at AT&TThreatTraq@list.att.com. You can find the AT&T ThreatTraq program on the AT&T Tech channel, as well as on YouTube and iTunes. Follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @ATT Security. Thanks, John. Thanks, Stan. Thanks, Matt. I'm John Hogoboom. We'll be back next week with a new episode. Until then, keep your network safe.